Hi, I'm Robin Worley, welcome to Lenscraft. This week I'm sharing some tips about landscape photo editing in Capture One. If you follow me already, you'll probably know that I'm a landscape photographer and that I shoot using a Fuji X-T camera. When I first switched to Fuji, I was skeptical about the claimed image quality because my results were poor. The problem I had and didn't realise was that Lightroom doesn't make a great job of processing the Fuji X-T RAW files. At the time, I blamed the camera. It hadn't occurred to me how much difference the RAW converter can actually make until I tried Capture One. Now, despite Capture One improving the quality of my RAW conversions, I found it a struggle to use. I had used Capture One some years earlier, but it had progressed significantly and I needed to relearn a lot of things. And when I talk about relearning the software, I don't mean learning how the controls work. I'm talking about learning all the tricks and techniques that may seem minor but can make a big difference to the quality of your landscape photos. In this video, I want to share some of the things that I've learned whilst editing my landscape photos with Capture One and trying to keep the results looking natural. This is the starting image, which is a RAW file captured using a Fuji X-T2 and the Fuji 18-135 lens. If we look at the metadata in Capture One, you can see that the focal length is 20mm. This lens isn't known as a great performer and it's probably at its worst at the wide end of its focal length. It tends to have a lot of distortion and isn't as sharp as at the longer focal lengths, especially in the corners of the frame. I also used an aperture of f14, which is quite small for this scene, so we might see some softness creeping in because of diffraction. Now, the problem with this shot is that it's a high contrast scene with deep shadows. Ideally I should have used a filter on the lens, but I didn't, so this is the best we have to work with. My first step when producing all my images in Capture One is to check the lens profile and settings. In the lens correction panel, you'll see there's a drop down at the top where you can select the lens profile. The two that are usually worth checking are the manufacturer profile, which I'm assuming is the one that's embedded in the RAW file, and the default profile, which is the one that's shipped with Capture One. The Capture One profile tends to be better with some lenses. With this lens, it also enables the sharpness slider, which I'll come to in a moment. By default, the distortion setting is at 100, which is correcting the lens distortion. If I move the slider over to 0, it turns off the correction. A useful tip when comparing these two settings is to click the slider wording. When I click the word distortion, you can see the slider temporarily returns to the default setting until I release the mouse. This is something that works with all of the sliders in Capture One. Comparing the two settings, I prefer the image with the distortion removed. Another useful tip when adjusting sliders is that you can double click on the slider itself to reset it to its default value. I'm also finding the browser thumbnails over on the right are a little bit distracting, so I'm just going to hide them by pressing Command and B. If you're using a Windows PC, that's Control and B. Using this shortcut will toggle the browser off and on. Now let's check for any softness in the corner of the frame. When I zoom to 100% magnification, looking at the corner of this image, it isn't too bad. This is probably because the distortion correction is cropping away the corners. If I can see any softness though, I can reduce it by using the sharpness fall off slider. Watch what happens in the corner if I set it to the maximum value and then toggle it off and on. Whilst we're looking at the corners of the frame, you can probably see a coloured fringe along some of the branches in the trees. Be sure to have the chromatic aberration reduction turned on to remove it. Sometimes that doesn't entirely remove the problem and you're left with a faint purple fringe. If that happens, also use the defringe slider. The final option I want to discuss in the lens section of Capture One is the diffraction correction. This can be a great way to sharpen up the detail in an image that's become slightly softened because of your lens suffering from diffraction. Watch what happens to the fine detail in the tree branches when I turn it on. They snap into focus and if anything just become a little bit too sharp. Now I'm going to leave the diffraction correction turned on for the moment whilst we look at the sharpening settings. In the sharpening section, Capture One applies a default sharpening based on the type of RAW file you're processing. If this were a RAW file from my Panasonic G9, you'd see different default settings here. But just because these are the default settings in Capture One, it doesn't mean they're the best. With landscape photos where there's a lot of fine detail, I like to change the settings to emphasize that detail. Typically, I reduce the threshold to around 0.5 so that the sharpening is being applied to less well-defined edges. I also like to reduce the radius to 0.5 so that the sharpening halo isn't as wide along the edges. Finally, with an image like this that's been shot at base ISO, I'll remove the noise reduction. The noise reduction has a slight softening effect, but it isn't needed in this image. If I later find I can see noise, I'll add the noise reduction back. With these settings applied, I can now increase the sharpening amount slider until the fine details become crisp. At this point, I'm just going to switch back to the lens correction and disable the diffraction correction because I don't think it's required. I personally feel that diffraction correction can make fine details appear too strong and a little unnatural, so only use it where you really need to. Sharpening alone often produces a nicer effect where the distant detail is a little bit softer and more difficult to see. With all that done, I'm now going to look at the base colour profile I'm using for the RAW conversion. In the base characteristics panel, I can see the type of camera and the profile curve. In the profile curve drop-down, you can see the various Fuji simulations supported by the X-T2. I've found with my Fuji landscapes that the three variations of the film curve work well most of the time. If I hover over these with my mouse, you can see the difference between them. Now at one time, I would have been tempted to choose the film extra shadow option to help control the contrast in the scene. Now I feel the contrast helps make this image, and opening the shadows everywhere causes the image to lose something. Instead, I'm going to use the film standard, and I'll correct the deep shadows shortly using an adjustment layer. Next, I'm going to warm the light slightly by increasing the Kelvin slider to around 6000. But what I don't want to do is warm the entire image too much. If I increase the Kelvin slider further, it makes the trees look great, but it doesn't suit the sky or the shadow areas. This is another place that I need to use an adjustment layer to selectively warm just the light that's falling on the trees. Now it's time to correct the tones in the image. Currently the image has a little bit too much contrast, with the shadows appearing blocked up in the wall and the reflection on the canal. The sky is also a little bit too bright, causing the blue to fade out to white. I'll start by fixing the dark shadow areas in the scene by slowly increasing the shadow slider. But if I increase this too far, it makes the shadows appear unnatural, so I'm going to limit it to around a setting of 15. It's tempting to try to correct the darkest areas of the image, but that's a mistake if you want a natural result. Try to ignore the very dark areas and instead correct the overall image. Now for the highlights and blue sky, which I want to address with the white slider. Whilst I can reduce this all the way down to -100, the sky loses the white above the canal, which again looks unnatural. Instead, I'm going to set this to -50 and then the highlight slider to around -20. This is enough to recover most of the blue in the sky without making it appear false. I'm now going to add an adjustment layer to address some of the problems I mentioned earlier. The first layer I want to add is to selectively open the deep shadows. The way I'm going to do this is by adding a new filled adjustment layer. This means that any adjustment I apply to the layer applies to the entire image. I'll call this layer Wall. I'm going to apply my adjustments while zoomed in at 100% on the wall area. Zooming onto the area I want to adjust stops my judgment being clouded by how the rest of the image appears. Notice that I'm using the blacks and shadows slider to lighten the wall. But this also reduces the contrast and makes the area look a little flat. To counter this, I'll increase the clarity and structure slider. Another problem when you open the shadows in this way is that they don't have much saturation, so I'll increase that slider as well. I can then see clearly that the colour balance in the wall has a pink tint. I'll therefore reduce the tint and the Kelvin slider to make it appear greener and bluer. When doing this, be careful because it's extremely easy to make the adjustment too strong. If I now zoom out, you can see the effect this is having on the entire image. The next step is to restrict the adjustment by right-clicking on the layer and selecting the Clear Mask option. This allows me to then use the brush tool to paint the adjustment onto selected areas. If I right click on the image when I'm using the brush tool, I open the brush settings. I've found when using Capture One it's better to use a high opacity setting and control the brush strokes using a low flow. I can now paint onto the wall and the tree trunk to open up the shadows there. I'll also apply a little adjustment to the shadows and reflection on the opposite bank of the canal. I don't want to apply too much though, as it will make the area appear too green and it will just look wrong. Now it's time for another layer to enhance the golden light on the trees. As before, I'll add a new filled adjustment layer and zoom into the trees that I want to enhance. I'll also rename the layer to be trees so I can remember in the months to come what it's adjusting. I'm going to start by increasing the Kelvin slider to around 6700, which gives the light on the trees a nice golden feel. I might also reduce the tint slider as it's appearing a little bit too pink. Now, because this area has sun falling onto it, I want it to be a little lighter and have more contrast. I also want to increase the saturation to make those colours stand out a little bit more. As I've been stressing in this video, limit the strength of these adjustments to help retain a natural feel. If I zoom out, you can see the image has a golden feel now, but it doesn't suit all areas. When I clear the mask it hides the effect and I can again use the paintbrush tool to paint in the effect onto the trees. I then have an opacity setting on each of the layers that I can use to balance their overall effects on the image. Now I could carry on with further adjustments, but I'll stop there. The key things to remember when adjusting landscape photos to achieve a natural look are: ask yourself how this image would look in nature rather than thinking, "Ooh, I like that effect, let's make it stronger." Make small adjustments and build them up using layers rather than making a single large change. Divide your image into separate areas and then adjust those areas using independent layers. Once you can achieve a lot with a raw conversion, you can also treat it as a first step. After raw processing, it often helps to continue your editing with the likes of Photoshop, Affinity and the Nik collection. I hope you've enjoyed today's video and found a few useful tips you can use. I'm Robin Worley, you've been watching Lenscraft. I'll see you soon for another video.